The streets buzzed with life, but for Ion, they were nothing more than a blur. The weight of unseen shackles kept him from moving forward. At 27, he was supposed to have figured things out, his career, his future, his dreams. But the reality was far from the expectations he once had. The world that once promised endless possibilities now felt like a cage tightening around him with each passing day. Bills stacked on a small wooden table in his cramped one-room apartment. His phone screen blinked with messages, some from recruiters rejecting his job applications, others from friends who had long since stopped waiting for him to join them. The weight of responsibilities was suffocating. His parents, aging and dependent, needed his financial support, yet he barely had enough to keep himself afloat. Every morning, he woke up to the same thought, what am I even doing? And every night, he fell asleep with the same unanswered question. It wasn't that he hadn't tried. He had, but every effort led to another closed door. Every dream ended in another disappointment. Failure was no longer an event in his life. It had become a state of existence. Ion had always believed that hard work would lead to success, but what he hadn't accounted for were the countless hurdles that would block his path. He had a degree, he had skills, but the world didn't seem to care. The rejection emails felt personal now, as if the world was screaming that he wasn't good enough. His father's silent disappointment, his mother's fading smile, everything reminded him that he was losing the battle. His closest friends had moved on, climbing the ladders of success, while he remained stuck at the bottom, drowning in an ocean of failures. He tried. Again and again, he sent out resumes. He prepared for interviews, putting on a mask of confidence that cracked the moment he faced yet another rejection. The job market was ruthless, and no one had the patience for a struggling, desperate man like him. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, hopelessness began to wrap around him like a thick fog. His savings dwindled, his motivation faded, and his dreams, once vibrant and full of promise, became distant shadows. Nights were the worst. In the darkness, his failures screamed the loudest. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all life had to offer. Was this it? A cycle of disappointment with no escape? The world outside continued to move, uncaring and relentless. And Ion, he was sinking. He was losing himself in the darkness, trapped in an endless loop of despair. The voices had started as whispers, small, nagging doubts that crept into his mind when he wasn't paying attention. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you'll always be a failure. Maybe this is where your story ends. At first, he fought back. He reminded himself of his past victories, his small moments of triumph. But as the rejections piled up, the whispers grew louder. Society's expectations became suffocating. Relatives who once praised him now avoided eye contact. Neighbors who once asked about his ambitions now pitted him. And worst of all, he began to believe the whispers. The mirror reflected a man he no longer recognized. Tired eyes, slouched shoulders, and a spirit that had lost its fire. He wasn't the Ion he used to be. The boy who once dreamed of conquering the world was now struggling to survive in it. One evening, as he sat on his small balcony staring at the city lights, a thought crossed his mind. Would the world even notice if I disappeared? It was a fleeting thought, a dangerous one, but it lingered longer than it should have. His phone buzzed, a message from his younger sister. "Bye, I miss you. When will you visit home?" Ion exhaled sharply, blinking away the tears that threatened to escape. He couldn't let himself fall any further. But how could he rise when everything around him was pulling him down? As the night deepened, so did his thoughts. Was this truly the end of his story? Or was there still a chance to rewrite it? Little did he know, the storm within him was about to give birth to something far greater. His rise was coming. He just didn't see it yet. Darkness clung to the city like an unshakable curse. The streets deserted, save for the lonely whispers of the wind that howled through the hollow alleys. Arian staggered down the empty road, his mind a battlefield of torment. His clothes were soaked, not with rain, but with the remnants of his shattered pride. Every step he took felt heavier, as if unseen chains dragged him deeper into despair. Everything had collapsed. The job he had fought for, gone. The love he had cherished, lost. His dreams, now nothing more than ashes. He had never imagined falling this low, but here he was, drowning in a pit where even his own shadow seemed to mock him. His breath was uneven, his pulse erratic. He reached a deserted bench near the old railway tracks and collapsed onto it, head in his hands, fingers digging into his scalp as if trying to pull himself out of his own mind. Memories assaulted him. His father's proud face when he got his first job, his mother's soft hands brushing his hair when he was a child, promising him that life would always make way for those who dared to dream. Lies. Empty, cruel eyes. He let out a bitter laugh, but it quickly turned into a sob. The weight on his chest was unbearable, suffocating him as if the very air had turned against him. His fingers clenched into fists. He wanted to scream, to rage against the world, but his voice refused to cooperate. All he could do was sit in the suffocating silence, his body trembling under the crushing realization. He had nothing left. No home, no future, no reason to exist. For the first time in his life, Arian felt truly alone. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone. No missed calls, no messages. No one was looking for him. It was as if he had been erased from existence. His thumb hovered over a contact, his sister. But what would he say? That he was broken? That he had failed? That the brother she once looked up to was now nothing more than a shadow? Tears blurred his vision as he put the phone down. He couldn't do it. He couldn't let her see him like this. Instead, he tilted his head back and looked at the sky. It was empty, a vast stretch of darkness with not a single star to be seen. Even the universe had turned its back on him. His throat burned as he whispered, his voice barely audible against the wind. If there's anyone out there, give me a sign. Please. Just one sign. Silence. His breath hitched, the last of his strength draining from his body. He closed his eyes, ready to give up, to fade into nothingness. But just as he was about to let go, something shifted. A distant chime. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented. The sound came again, soft but clear like the delicate ringing of a bell. He turned his head toward the railway tracks and saw something strange, a faint glow in the distance. The glow flickered, almost like a mirage, but Arian knew he wasn't imagining it. Something about it felt different, as if it were calling to him. He hesitated, then stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He took a step forward, then another, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. As he approached, he saw it wasn't just light. It was a lantern, small, swaying gently in the breeze, placed carefully on the railway tracks. Next to it was a piece of paper, fluttering slightly under the weight of a single stone. With trembling hands, Arian picked up the paper and read the words scribbled in black ink. You are not alone. Keep going. His breath caught in his throat. He looked around, searching for the person who had left it there, but the streets were empty. He clutched the note to his chest, his heart pounding. Who had written this? And why? But more than anything, a strange warmth spread through him. A reminder that someone somewhere had left this message for him. A stranger who had no idea who he was, yet had somehow saved him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Arian felt a spark of hope. He turned his gaze back to the sky, and this time a single star twinkled back at him through the darkness. The cold wind whispered to the narrow alleyways as Arian walked aimlessly, his mind still reeling from a message he had found near the railway tracks. The note had ignited something within him, a flicker of hope in the vast emptiness he had come to know. But was it enough? Could a simple message really change the course of his life? His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed a figure sitting on a worn-out wooden bench outside an old tea stall. The man looked ancient, his silver hair illuminated under the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. He wore a tattered shawl draped over his shoulders, his wrinkled hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chai. His eyes, however, held a strange depth, as if he had seen the entire universe unfold before him. Arian hesitated, but the man's gaze met his, piercing through him as though he could see every scar hidden within his soul. Without a word, the old man gestured for Arian to sit beside him. Unsure why, Arian obeyed. Lost, are we? The old man said, his voice carrying the weight of time. Arian let out a hollow chuckle. Is it that obvious? The man took a sip of his tea before nodding. Pain leaves a trail. Only those who have walked through it can recognize it. Arian looked away, staring at the empty street before them. I don't know what to do anymore. I've lost everything. The old man chuckled softly. Lost? Or simply misplaced? Sometimes we don't lose ourselves. We just forget where we are meant to be. Arian frowned, his frustration rising. And what if there is no meant to be? What if this is all there is? His voice trembled with suppressed anguish. The old man studied him for a moment, then placed his cup down. Then why did you pick up the note? Arian's breath hitched. He turned sharply. How do you? The old man simply smiled. You asked for a sign. You received one. Now the question is, what will you do with it? The old man's words lingered in Arian's mind long after he had left the tea stall. He walked through the city, the neon lights flickering, the honking of distant cars blending with the murmurs of the night. Something about the encounter gnawed at him. It was as if the universe had placed a choice before him. continue drowning in despair, or take the first step into the unknown. But stepping into the unknown meant believing in something beyond himself. It meant embracing uncertainty. And Arian had spent too long fearing what he could not control. He stopped in front of a bridge, staring down at the water below. His reflection wavered with the gentle ripples, fragmented and uncertain, just like him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the note again. "You are not alone. Keep going." He inhaled deeply. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to believe in something again. Taking one last look at his reflection, Arian stepped away from the bridge. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to move, because if he stayed in the same place, he would never find out what lay ahead. The first challenge came sooner than he expected. He hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. His savings were gone, and every potential job he had applied for had turned him away. The world was still as unforgiving as it had been before. Doubt began to creep back in, whispering that nothing had changed, that his so-called sign was nothing more than an illusion. Exhausted and starving, he found himself at the doorstep of a small, run-down community center. The signboard above read, "Shelter and Service, a place for new beginnings." Hesitantly, he stepped inside. The air was filled with the scent of warm food and the quiet hum of conversation. Volunteers bustled about, serving meals, offering clothes, and tending to those who had nowhere else to go. Among them, he spotted a familiar figure, the old man from the tea stall. "Ah, you made it," the old man said, smiling as if he'd been expecting him. Arian swallowed. "What is this place?" "A refuge for those who seek a second chance," the old man replied. "A place where those who have fallen can rise again." Arian hesitated. I don't belong here." The old man chuckled. "And where do you belong? In the shadows of despair? Or in the light of possibility?" Something inside Arian shifted. He clenched his fists. I just don't know if I can do this. If I can start over." The old man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Every great journey begins with doubt. The question is, will you take the first step despite it?" Arian stayed. At first, it was just for a meal, then a night, then a week. Slowly, he became part of the center, helping with chores, assisting others who had lost their way. It wasn't easy. There were days he wanted to give up, when the weight of his past clawed at him. But each time, he remembered the note, the lantern, the old man's words. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, he found himself sitting alone in the center's courtyard. The old man approached him, carrying 2 cups of chai. "You've done well," he said, handing Arian one of the cups. Arian shook his head. "I still feel lost." The old man chuckled. "Lost? Or simply on a road you've never walked before?" Arian exhaled. "Maybe both." The old man took a sip of his tea. "That's the beauty of the journey, my boy. The road less traveled is never easy, but it is always worth it." Arian stared at the horizon, a small smile forming on his lips. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. And that, he realized, was enough. The night was cold, but Arian barely noticed. Sitting alone on the rooftop of the community center, he stared at the city lights stretching into the distance. He had been here for weeks now, working, learning, surviving. Yet inside, he felt as if he were standing at the edge of a battlefield, facing an invisible enemy, his own mind. The whispers of his past had not left him. They lingered like smoke, suffocating and relentless. "You're not good enough. You're a failure. No matter what you do, you'll never escape what you lost." Every night, the voices grew louder. He had made progress, yes, but the wounds of his past still bled beneath the surface. And so, on this night, under a sky that held no answers, he finally let himself break. He clenched his fists and let out a scream, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the silence. The pain, the regret, the self-loathing, all of it erupted at once. He punched the rooftop floor, his knuckles scraping against the rough surface. He wanted to fight, but against what? Against himself? Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "Why? Why did everything have to fall apart? Why am I still here?" He expected silence, but instead, he heard footsteps behind him. "Because fire does not destroy gold," the familiar voice of the old man said. "It refines it." Arian turned, his breath ragged. The old man walked closer, his gaze calm yet piercing. "You are still here because you are not meant to be lost forever. You are meant to be rebuilt." Arian shook his head. "I don't know how. I don't know who I am anymore." The old man smiled, sitting beside him. Then let the fire show you. The next few weeks tested Arian in ways he had never imagined. Every morning, he woke up before sunrise to help prepare meals for the homeless. Every day, he worked alongside volunteers, listening to stories of those who had suffered more than he ever had. And every night, he sat with the old man, talking, questioning, unlearning. The process was brutal. He was forced to confront the lies he had carried for years, beliefs that he was worthless, that he had failed beyond redemption, that he had no future. The old man made him challenge every thought, every assumption. Who told you failure is the end? He would ask. Who told you suffering means you are not worthy of joy? Bit by bit, Arian started to rebuild. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was in small moments, helping a child find a lost shoe, seeing an old man smile after receiving a warm meal, learning to laugh again, even if just for a second. One evening, as he wiped down the tables after dinner, a little girl approached him, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. "For you," she said, smiling shyly. Curious, Arian unfolded it. It was a simple drawing of him, standing next to the community center, a golden sun shining above his head. At the bottom, in crooked handwriting, were the words, "You make people happy." Something inside him shifted. For the first time, he saw himself not as a broken man, but as someone capable of bringing light to others. Faith was not something Arian had ever understood. To him, it had always been an illusion, a crutch for those who couldn't accept reality. But now, as he stood on the same rooftop where he had once broken down, he began to see it differently. Faith was not about certainty. It was about surrender. It was about stepping forward even when the path was unclear. Trust the process, the old man had told him, even when it hurts, even when it makes no sense. And so, Arian chose to trust. He chose to believe that his past did not define him, that his pain was not a prison, that he was not alone. One morning, as he walked through the center, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a glass window. He paused. He did not see the man who had once stood on the edge of despair. He saw someone new, someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger, someone ready to rise. Arian had thought he had conquered his demons. He had rebuilt himself in the ashes, learned to trust the process, and even found purpose in serving others. But life had one final test for him, one that would determine if he was truly ready to rise. It began with a phone call, a known number. Hesitation gripped him as he answered. Arian. The voice on the other end was weak, but unmistakable. His father, his breath caught in his throat. It had been years since he last heard from him, the man who had once towered over him, full of rage and unfulfilled dreams, the man who had called him a failure, who had crushed him with the weight of expectations, who had never once told him he was enough. I need your help, his father said, voice cracking. Arian felt his entire being freeze. A war erupted within him. The scars of his childhood, the pain of never being accepted, the night spent wondering why he was never good enough. It all came rushing back. He wanted to hang up. He wanted to run. But something inside him whispered, this is the final test. Swallowing hard, he asked, "Where are you?" His father was in a small hospital on the outskirts of the city. Liver failure. The doctor had said years of alcohol abuse had taken their toll. The man who had once seemed so powerful now looked frail, his skin pale, his hands trembling. "I don't deserve to ask for your help," his father admitted, unable to meet Arian's eyes. "But I have no one else." Arian clenched his fists. The boy inside him screamed, demanding justice for all the years of neglect, for the wounds that had never fully healed. But the man he had become, the one who had walked through fire, understood something his father never had. Forgiveness was not for the one who had hurt him. It was for himself. He let out a slow breath. "I'll help you," he said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry this pain any longer." His father's eyes filled with something Arian had never seen before, regret. In that moment, the chains of his past shattered. The generational curse of anger, of abandonment, of pain, it ended with him. Helping his father was not easy. There were days when bitterness threatened to return, when the weight of old wounds tried to pull him down. But he had learned resilience. He had learned that pain did not have to define him. He watched his father struggle through recovery, through withdrawal, through nights of unbearable suffering. But for the first time in his life, Arian saw something different in the man. Guilt, yes, but also the desperate desire to change. One evening, as Arian sat beside him, his father finally spoke the words he had longed to hear. "I was wrong," his father whispered. "About you, about everything. And I'm sorry. Tears burned Arian's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He only nodded, because some wounds did not need words to heal, only time. As his father recovered, Arian found himself standing at another crossroad. He had helped rebuild others. But what about his own dreams? What about the fire within him? He thought back to the note he had found that night near the railway tracks. You are not alone. Keep going. And suddenly, he knew what he had to do. The small community center that had once saved him had become his home, his place of healing. But now he wanted to do more. He wanted to build something greater, something that would ensure no one else ever felt as lost as he once had. With the help of volunteers, he expanded the center into something bigger, a sanctuary not just for the homeless, but for anyone battling demons, be they of the mind, heart, or past. A place for healing, for second chances. The name? The Phoenix Rise, because he had risen. And now, he would help others do the same. Years passed. His center grew, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. People came to him not just for food or shelter, but for hope. They sought guidance, strength, and a kind of light that only someone who had once been in the darkness could offer. One evening, as he walked through the center, he found a young man sitting alone, staring at the ground, much like Arian himself had done years ago. Arian sat beside him. Lost. The boy flinched, then slowly nodded. Arian smiled, pulling out a small folded note from his pocket, the same one that had saved him all those years ago. He handed it to the boy, who hesitantly opened it. You are not alone. Keep going. The boy's breath hitched, and for the first time, he looked up at Arian. Do you really believe that? Arian placed a firm hand on his shoulder. I don't just believe it. I know it. And in that moment, the cycle continued. The boy who had once been lost had become the guide. The phoenix had risen. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the Phoenix Rise. The sanctuary that had become more than just a center. It had become a symbol of transformation. Arian stood at the entrance, watching as volunteers helped newcomers settle in, laughter echoing from the courtyard where children played. It was a scene he had never dared to dream of before, yet here it was, his reality. As he walked through the hallways, he saw the impact of his journey reflected in the lives of those around him. A once homeless man now worked as a counselor, guiding others out of despair. A woman who had escaped an abusive past had become a leader in women's empowerment programs. A troubled youth, much like Arian had once been, was now teaching music to children, finding peace in melodies rather than destruction. The blessings had unfolded in ways beyond his comprehension. The world had responded to his perseverance. Donations poured in, allowing the center to expand across multiple cities. News outlets covered his story, calling him the man who rose from ashes. But it wasn't the fame or recognition that mattered. It was the knowledge that every struggle, every night of doubt, every tear had led to this. One evening, as he sat in his office, a letter arrived. The handwriting was shaky, yet unmistakable. Son, I may not have much time left, but I needed you to know I am proud of you. The man you have become is greater than I ever was. And because of you, I found peace before the end. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Your father. Tears welled in Arian's eyes. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. It was closure, not just for him, but for generations before him. The cycle had been broken. His father had left this world knowing love, something neither of them had thought possible. And now, Arian was free. Invitations began arriving. Conferences, TED Talks, global summits. People wanted to hear his story, to know how a man who had once stood on the brink of destruction had built a legacy of hope. He hesitated at first. His journey had been deeply personal, raw, and painful. Could he truly stand before thousands and bare his soul? But then he remembered the boy who had once sat in darkness, waiting for a sign that life was still worth living. If his story could be that sign for someone else, then he had no choice. His first speech was in a packed auditorium. As he stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. There was a time when I believed I was meant to fade into nothingness, that I was beyond saving, that no matter how hard I fought, my past would always pull me back. But I was wrong. He looked into the eyes of the audience, some filled with pain, others with hope. I learned that pain is not our enemy. It is our teacher. I learned that faith is not about knowing the way. It is about walking forward even when the path is unseen. And I learned that no matter how broken we are, we can rise. We will rise. The applause was deafening. People stood, clapping, cheering, some wiping away tears. He had given them more than words. He had given them proof that triumph was possible. As he stepped off the stage, a young woman approached him, trembling. "I was going to end my life tonight," she whispered. "But because of you, I won't." Arian's breath caught. He took her hands in his, steadying her. "You are not alone. Keep going." In that moment, he knew this was his purpose, not just to rise, but to help others do the same. Years passed, and the Phoenix Rise became a global movement. Arian traveled the world, sharing his story, building centers in places he had never imagined visiting. From small villages to grand cities, he carried the message of resilience, faith, and transformation. One evening, as he stood on the shores of a quiet beach, watching the waves crash against the sand, he realized something profound. He was no longer afraid. Not of failure, not of pain, not of the unknown. The boy who had once lived in fear had become a man who embraced life fully. As he watched the sun set, his phone buzzed. A message from a young man he had mentored. "I got the job. You were right. I am capable." "Thank you." Arian smiled. This was his legacy, not in the buildings he had constructed or the stages he had spoken on, but in the lives he had touched, in the strength he had passed on. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, he whispered a silent prayer, not for himself, but for the world, that no soul would ever feel alone, that everyone who had been lost would find their way back, that every phoenix would rise. And with that, Arian stepped forward, embracing a future that was limitless, boundless, and fearless. He had not just survived, he had conquered, he had risen, and now he was free,